to start by saying I've told this story maybe 4 times to people who actually know me, and every single time, halfway through, I watch their face change. Not like they think I'm lying, more like they're trying to figure out how to respond to something they don't have a box for. So I'm just going to write it out the way it happened, in order, and you can decide what you think. This was in October of 2023. I was 29, living in Bishop, California, which, if you don't know it, is a small town on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada, 95. I worked as a physical therapy assistant at a clinic on Line Street, and on weekends, I picked up shifts guiding day hikers for a little outfitter that ran trips up toward the Lake Sabrina and North Lake area in the John Muir Wilderness. It wasn't a big operation. 3 guides, a guy named Roy who owned it, and a website that hadn't been updated since 2019. I did it mostly because I loved being up there, not for the money. That October, Roy asked me if I wanted to take a solo trip up to check on one of the backcountry huts we sometimes used as a rest point for multi-day groups. It wasn't a real hut in the official sense, more like a rough plywood and tin structure that had been built decades ago by some fish and game crew, half legal, half just tolerated by the Forest Service because it had been there so long. It sat off a spur trail past Sabrina Lake, maybe 5 miles in, at just under 10,500 feet. Roy wanted someone to make sure the door hadn't been torn off by wind, that no bears had gotten into it, that kind of thing, before he brought a group through the following week. I want to be clear about my state of mind going in, because it matters later. I was not spooked. I was not the kind of person who got nervous alone in the woods. I'd done probably 200 solo days in the Sierras by that point. I knew how to read weather coming in over the crest. I knew how to keep my food away from bears. I'd slept alone in far more remote spots than this one. If anything, I was looking forward to a quiet overnight before the season really shut down for the year. I left the trailhead at North Lake around 9 a.m. on a Thursday. Cold morning, low 30s, my breath fogging, frost still on the willows near the creek crossing. I had a Forsen tent I didn't really need but liked the extra room in, a stove, about a day and a half of food, and a Garmin InReach for emergency comms since there's no cell service out there at all. I remember what I was wearing because I still have the jacket, a faded orange Patagonia shell that used to be my dad's. The hike in was uneventful. I passed 2 other parties coming down. Both said the trail was clear. No snow yet that year, even though it was late in the season. I got some fall color still hanging on in the aspens near the lower lake. The air smelled like pine and cold rock, that thin, clean, high-altitude smell. I got to the hut around 1:30 in the afternoon. The hut itself was exactly like I remembered from the last time I'd been up, maybe 8 months prior. 1 room, maybe 12 by 14 feet, a wood stove in the corner that hadn't been used in years because Forest Service discouraged fires up there, a couple of built-in bunks with old, mouse-chewed foam pads on them, and a logbook that hikers and the occasional ranger would sign. I did my walkthrough, checked the roof seams, checked for animal damage. Everything looked fine. I figured I'd set up my own tent outside rather than sleep in the hut itself. Force of habit. I never liked sleeping indoors when I didn't have to. Plus the hut smelled like mouse urine, which is pretty standard for these places, but not pleasant. I want to slow down here because this is where the first thing happened, and at the time, I genuinely didn't think anything of it. While I was doing my walkthrough, I flipped open the logbook just to glance at recent entries. Partly professional curiosity, partly just something to do. Most entries were what you'd expect. Stuff like that, but the second to last entry, dated 11 days before I got there, just said this. Someone was already here when I arrived. He left before I could say hi. No name signed, no other details. I remember reading it twice and just kind of shrugging it off. People write weird things in trail logbooks all the time, half joking, trying to be spooky for the next hiker. I didn't think about it again until later that evening, and even then only a little. I set up my tent about 30 feet from the hut, in a flat spot near a cluster of white bark pines, facing out toward the basin so I'd get the sunrise. I made dinner around 5, one of those dehydrated backpacker meals, chicken and rice, ate it sitting on a rock watching the light go orange and then pink on the peaks to the west. Mount Heckle, Mount Wallace, that ridge line. It was completely silent except for wind moving through the pines every so often. No other people. No animal sounds beyond one distant sound I took for a marmot alarm call. I remembered texting my girlfriend at the time. Well, I couldn't text, no signal, but I typed out a message in my phone's notes app the way I always did on trips, planning to send it once I got back to the car. I still have that note somewhere, actually, which is a strange thing to still have. I got in my tent a little after 7:30, read for a bit with a headlamp, some paperback I'd brought, and fell asleep probably around 9. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone immediately, out of habit. You develop a reflex for it when you camp alone a lot. You want to know how much night is left. What woke me up was that I heard the door of the hut open. It's a distinctive sound. The hut door was this heavy plank thing on old hinges that hadn't been oiled probably ever, and it had a specific creak and drop sound when it swung, because the bottom edge dragged slightly on the frame. I'd opened and closed it myself earlier that day doing my inspection, so I knew exactly what it sounded like. And I heard it again at 2:13 in the morning, 30 feet from my tent. I lay completely still. My first thought, honestly, was a bear. Black bears will absolutely mess with structures if they smell food residue, and even though I hadn't left anything in there, an old hut like that probably had decades of scent in the walls. So I stayed quiet, waiting to hear the kind of clumsy, heavy movement a bear makes. Instead, I heard footsteps, human footsteps, deliberate, on the wood floor inside the hut. Slow. Then they stopped. Then nothing for a long time. I'm talking maybe 10, 15 minutes of nothing, where I'm lying in my sleeping bag with my heart going, trying to convince myself I imagined the footsteps, that it was branches, that it was my own blood in my ears. I had a small folding knife in my pack, which is not really a weapon against anything, but I got my hand around it anyway just to have something to hold. Then I heard the hut door again, open, and this time, footsteps outside on the dirt and pine needles. Slow, unhurried, and then they were coming toward my tent. I want to describe this as precisely as I can because it's the part that still gets me. It wasn't a fast, aggressive approach. It was almost worse than that. It was casual, like someone taking a walk. The footsteps stopped maybe 8 or 10 feet from my tent, on the side where I don't have a window, just the fabric wall. And then I heard breathing. Not panting, not labored, just someone breathing normally, close enough that I could hear it over the wind. I didn't say anything. I know that probably sounds insane, that the normal reaction would be to call out, ask who's there, something, but every part of my body was telling me to stay silent. And I've thought about it a lot since I think some animal part of your brain overrides the social part in that moment. The part that would normally say, "Excuse me," the way you would to a stranger who bumped into you at the grocery store. My brain wasn't treating this like an awkward social situation. It was treating it like something that could hurt me. The breathing continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably closer to 30 or 40 seconds. Then I heard fabric. Not my tent fabric, but the sound of clothing moving, like someone shifting their weight or crouching down. And then very quietly, almost like they didn't mean for me to hear it, a voice said, "That's it. That's the whole thing," they said. A man's voice, not loud, not threatening in tone exactly, almost conversational, like he was making an observation rather than a threat. But the content of it, the fact that he was commenting on the timing, like he had some kind of ownership over who was allowed up there and when, that's what did it for me. I still didn't respond. I lay there gripping this useless little pocket knife, and I heard him exhale, a long breath, and then the footsteps moved away. Not toward the hut this time, off into the trees, toward the basin, away from the trail I'd come in on. I listened to them fade out completely, then silence again, just wind. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I lay there running through options. I had the inReach, which can send an SOS or a basic message via satellite, but what was I going to say? A man said something weird outside my tent and left. That's not an emergency by any definition a dispatcher is going to treat as urgent, and it would take hours for anyone to reach me anyway. My car was 5 miles back down a trail. I did not want to hike alone in the dark, with someone possibly still in the area. So I made the decision to just wait for the first gray came in around 6:15. I packed up as fast as I've ever packed a campsite, moving quiet but fast, and before I left, I made myself walk over and look in the hut one more time, mostly because I needed to know, and also because it was my job to check on the place. The logbook was open on the little shelf where I'd left it, but flipped to a different page than where I'd left it. On the most recent page, under my own entry from the afternoon before, I'd written something standard, checked structure, all good, staying overnight, my name guide. Someone had different handwriting, in pencil, a single line, nothing else, no name. I didn't touch it. I took a photo of it with my phone, which I still have, and I left. The hike out was the longest 5 miles of my life. I kept looking back. Every marmot alarm call, every branch cracking, I about jumped out of my boots. I made it to the trailhead around 8:40 a.m., and there was one other car in the little dirt lot, a faded green Ford Ranger with a camper shell, Inyo County plates, but the frame around the plate said a dealership out of Susanville, which is way up in the northeast part of the state, nowhere near Bishop. I didn't see anyone near it. I got in my own car, locked the doors, which I never do at trailheads, and drove straight to the Forest Service Ranger Station on West Line Street. I told the ranger on duty what happened. She was polite, took notes, but I could tell she didn't really know what to do with it. Nothing had technically happened to me. No theft, no injury, no direct threat you could point to as a crime. She said she'd log it and mention it to the district in case there were other reports. I asked if they knew anything about that hut, who built it, if there'd been any incidents up there before. She said it predated her. that it technically wasn't an authorized structure, and there had been talk over the years of tearing it down, but nobody had gotten around to it. I told Roy I wasn't comfortable running the group through that hut the following week, and he took it seriously enough to reroute them around it, though I don't think he fully believed how shaken I was. He made a joke about it being some hermit messing with hikers, which, fine maybe. That's actually the most likely explanation, and it's the one I tell myself on good days. There are people who live out there unofficially, off-grid, especially in the areas between Bishop and the Crest. It's not unheard of. Here's what I never got an answer to, though, and it's the thing that still sits wrong with me. About 6 weeks later, in early December, I was at a gear shop in Bishop Wilson's Eastside Sports, just picking up some replacement socks, and I got to talking with one of the guys who worked there about trail conditions. I mentioned, kind of offhand, the hut near Sabrina, and asked if he knew anything about it. I asked him to elaborate, and he said he didn't know more than that. It was secondhand from a friend of his. I didn't push it further because honestly, I didn't want more detail. I wanted less. I never went back to that hut. I still guide in that basin sometimes, but I take routes that avoid it now, and if a client wants to detour toward it, I find a reason to say no. I never found out who the man was, whether he lived up there, whether the handwriting in the logbook was his or someone else's, whether I know referred to something specific or nothing at all. I think about the fact that he knew I was a guide. That "you're not supposed to be up here this late in the year" line implies he knew something about the seasonal pattern of who comes through, which either means he'd been watching the hut for a long time, or he'd read the logbook himself and pieced it together the same way I would have. Either explanation bothers me for different reasons. The last thing I'll say is this. About a year later, a friend of mine who does trail maintenance for the Inyo National Forest told me, unprompted, that the hut had finally been torn down that summer by a Forest Service crew doing wilderness restoration work, clearing out unauthorized structures. I asked her if the crew had said anything about it, found anything unusual. She said she hadn't heard anything specific, just that it had been in worse shape than expected inside, whatever that means. I didn't ask her to clarify. Some questions I've learned I don't actually want answered. I still keep the folding knife on my keychain now, even in town. It doesn't do much, but it's something to hold. Story 2. The man at Horseshoe Meadow Trailhead. I need to say up front that I still work seasonal jobs in the Sierras, so I've changed a couple of small details here. Not the important ones, just things that could point back to exactly where I was employed. Everything that matters happened the way I'm about to describe it. In the summer of 2024, I was 24, finishing up my second season as a wilderness ranger for a district that covers part of the Southern Sierra, based out of a small station near Lone Pine, California, off Highway 395 in Inyo County. My job was mostly permit checks, bear canister compliance, trail condition reports, and occasional search and rescue support. I'd grown up in Ridgecrest, gone to Cal Poly Humboldt for environmental science, and taken this job mostly because I wanted an excuse to be outside instead of behind a desk. I drove a beat-up Tacoma with a National Forest parking pass on the dash and a Nalgene bottle covered in stickers from every trail I'd worked. That August, I was assigned to do patrol out of the Horseshoe Meadow Trailhead, which sits up above Lone Pine at around 10,000 feet, at the end of a long switchbacking road that climbs out of the Owens Valley. It's the access point for a bunch of routes into the Southern Sierra, including trails toward Cottonwood Lakes and connections into Sequoia National Park. It's popular with PCT hikers finishing sections, day hikers, and horsebackers, since there's a whole set of pack stations up. My patrols usually ran 2 or 3 days at a time, hiking a loop, checking permits, talking to people, camping out myself, then coming back to the trailhead to restock and drive down to town for a night before heading back up. I like the job specifically because of days like the one I'm about to describe, which started completely ordinary. It was a Tuesday, late August, and I'd hiked back down to the trailhead around 4 p.m. after a 2-night patrol loop through the Cottonwood Lakes Basin. My plan was to camp that night in the trailhead's small backcountry permit parking area, which rangers were allowed to use, then drive down to Lone Pine the next morning for supplies before heading back out. I remember it was warm for that elevation, mid-60s, with one of those huge cumulus buildups over the crest that you get most August afternoons, the kind that sometimes turns into an evening thunderstorm, and sometimes just fizzles out. There were maybe 6 or 7 other vehicles in the main trailhead lot when I got back, mostly hikers who'd left cars there for multi-day trips. I did a quick permit check walking the lot, which is standard, just making sure everyone parked there had left a valid wilderness permit visible on their dash the way they're supposed to. Most did. One truck didn't, a white F-250 with a camper shell and no plates on the front, which isn't required in California, so that wasn't unusual by itself. I made a note to check on it if I saw the owner. I set up my own tent off to the side of the lot, near the pit toilet building, ate dinner sitting on my tailgate. Some ramen doctored up with a foil packet of tuna, which is a classic ranger dinner if there ever was one, and radioed in my patrol summary to the district office before they closed up for the day. Normal stuff. I remember specifically that I was wearing a faded green Forest Service t-shirt, off-duty at that point technically, and I had a country station playing quietly off my phone speaker while I ate, one of the only stations that come in up there. Around 7:30, as the light was starting to go gold and long over the meadow, a man walked into the lot from the direction of the trail, not from a vehicle. He was maybe mid-40s, medium build, wearing a canvas jacket that was too warm for the weather, jeans and hiking boots that looked old, but not particularly worn from long-distance use. No dust caked into the seams the way you'd expect from someone coming off a real backcountry trip. He had a day pack, not an overnight pack, which struck me as slightly odd for someone coming down the trail that late in the day, since Horseshoe Meadow isn't the kind of trailhead people do short day loops from. Most of what's accessible from there requires overnight. He walked straight toward my truck. I want to be clear that talking to strangers at trailheads is genuinely a huge part of my job, so nothing about a guy walking up to me registered as unusual at first. I said hi, asked how his hike was. He said good, in this flat way, and then just stood there for a second, looking at my truck, at the Forest Service decal on the door, at my tent set up nearby. Then he asked if I was out here alone. I told him yes, which is standard for me to say to random hikers. I never really thought twice about my safety in that job, since it's mostly families, retirees, PCT through hikers, that demographic. But something about how he asked it made me pause, just slightly. Not aggressive, just specific. Like it was the actual point of the conversation rather than small. He asked if I'd seen anyone else on the trail toward Cottonwood Lakes in the past couple days. I told him I had, a handful of groups, nothing unusual. He nodded slowly and said, "There's a woman up there somewhere, dark green tent." I told him I hadn't seen a solo woman with a dark green tent and asked if he was trying to catch up with someone, if this was a friend or a party he'd split off from. At this point, I want to explain something about how rangers are trained to handle ambiguous situations, because it matters for what I did next. We're taught to never confirm or deny specific information about other visitors to strangers. For exactly this kind of scenario, actually. Stalking in domestic situations where someone uses a ranger as an unwitting source of information about where their target is. So even though I hadn't actually seen a woman matching that description, I gave him the standard non-answer. Told him I couldn't share specific information about other permit holders, but that if he was concerned about someone's safety, he could report it to the district office and we'd follow up appropriately. His face changed when I said that. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, like I'd said the wrong thing. He said, "Right, of course," and then he looked past me, toward my tent, for a second longer than felt normal, and said, "You should probably lock your truck up here." Then he turned and walked back toward the trail he'd come from, not toward any of the vehicles in the lot. It was nearly 8 p.m. by then, and the light was fading fast, the way it does at altitude. I remember watching him go and feeling this specific unease that I couldn't fully articulate at the time. Not fear exactly, more like the sense that a conversation had happened that I didn't fully understand the shape of. I radioed the district office again, off my normal schedule, and reported the interaction. A male subject, approximately mid-40s, asking about a solo female hiker with a dark green tent, behaving evasively when asked directly about his relationship to her. The dispatcher, a guy named Curtis, who I worked with a lot, said he'd log it and pass it to the on-call supervisor, but that without more to go on there wasn't much they could actively do that night. He did tell me, if I felt unsafe, I was authorized to relocate my camp or drive down to town instead of staying at the trailhead. I decided to stay, partly stubbornness, partly because I genuinely wasn't sure yet how seriously to take it, and partly because I didn't want to abandon the lot if there was a real welfare concern for a hiker up there. I moved my tent closer to my truck, checked that my doors were locked, and sat in the cab for a while with the radio on instead of my tent, telling myself I was just being cautious. Around 9:45 p.m., full dark, no moon yet, I saw headlights come slowly up the access road and into the lot. A car I didn't recognize, not the white F-250 from earlier, a dark sedan, older, maybe a Honda Accord, dust-covered like it had come a long way on dirt roads. It pulled into a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and the headlights went off. Nobody got out, not for a long time. I watched it in my side mirror, and I could see, just barely, in what little ambient light there was, that there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, unmoving. I sat there for probably 20 minutes debating whether to walk over and do a welfare check, which honestly was part of my job, but something about the stillness of it made me hesitant to approach alone in the dark. The window rolled down about halfway. It was a woman, maybe 30, hollow-eyed, looked like she hadn't slept in a long time. I asked if she was okay, if she needed anything. She said she was fine, just resting before heading up early in the morning. I asked, carefully, if she'd had any strange encounters with anyone recently. I didn't want to lead her, didn't want to plant the idea if it wasn't connected, but I also felt like I had to ask. She went very quiet. Then she asked me, "Did a man come through here tonight?" I told her yes. I watched her face when I said it, and I will never forget the specific way she closed her eyes for a second, like she'd been hoping the answer would be no. She told me, in pieces, not all at once, that she'd been getting followed for about 3 weeks. Not constantly. She said that was almost the worst part, the gaps. She'd see his truck near her apartment, then nothing for 4 or 5 days, then he'd be at her gym, then nothing again. She said she'd come up to the Sierras specifically because it felt like somewhere he couldn't follow her without it being obvious, without a plausible explanation for being there. She told almost no one where she was going. I stayed with her in the lot the rest of the night. We didn't sleep, really. We sat in her car with the doors locked and talked in low voices, and I kept my radio on in case anything happened. Around 3 a.m., I heard faintly an engine somewhere down the access road, idling, then moving off. I couldn't confirm it was him. I couldn't confirm it wasn't. At first light, I escorted her down the access road myself, following in my truck the entire 8 miles to the highway, and I stayed on the phone with Inyo County Sheriff's Dispatch until she was safely past Lone Pine and continuing south, out of the area, toward wherever she was actually from. She never told me, and I never asked. I filed a full incident report. The sheriff's office took a statement from her separately, I believe, though I never got confirmation of what happened after that, because that's not information they're going to share with a ranger who isn't part of the investigation. I never learned whether they identified him, whether the truck I'd seen in the lot that evening, the white F-250 with no front plate, belonged to him, or whether it was a coincidence and he'd left in some other vehicle I never saw. I never learned his name either, beyond the one she said to me that night, which I've chosen not to repeat. What still bothers me, more than a year later, isn't really the man himself, as unsettling as he was in that flat, careful way he talked. At the time, I read it as a generic, almost helpful-sounding warning. Looking back, knowing what I know now, it plays completely differently in my head. It sounds less like advice and more like a man telling on himself, half a threat and half a boast, testing whether I'd understand what he meant. I still work that district. I still patrol Horseshoe Meadow. But I don't camp alone in the lot anymore if I can help it. And if I ever see a canvas jacket on a man walking in alone, asking questions about a specific hiker, I don't give him the standard non-answer anymore. I've learned there's a version of that policy that's supposed to protect visitors. And there's a version of it that, in the wrong moment, just buys a predator a few more minutes of not knowing he's been noticed. I think about her sometimes. I hope genuinely that wherever she ended up, it worked. I never found out. Story 3. The neighbor at Rock Creek Lake Campground. I've sat on this one for a while before writing it down, mostly because it involves someone I still technically might run into again someday, and that thought alone still makes my stomach drop. I'm going to leave out anything that could identify him specifically, but everything that happened. In July of 2025, I was 31, living in Mammoth Lakes, California, where I worked as a night shift dispatcher for the local ambulance service, which meant my schedule was permanently backwards from most people's, asleep by 9 a.m., awake by 5 p.m. I'd moved out to Mammoth from Sacramento about 4 years earlier, chasing the mountains the way a lot of people who end up out there do, and by that point, I'd settled into a pretty solitary rhythm. Most of my friends worked days, so a lot of my time off was spent alone, which I liked. Camping was basically my version of a normal person's weekend at a bar. That particular week, I had 4 days off in a row, which almost never happened, and I decided to take my dog, a 50-pound heeler mix named Juniper, up to Rock Creek Lake Campground, which sits at about 9,600 feet off Rock Creek Road, south of Mammoth near Tom's Place. It's a developed campground, not backcountry. Paved loop roads, numbered sites, a campground host, the whole thing. Which I want to emphasize because this story isn't about being alone in the wilderness. It's about being surrounded by other people and still ending up in a situation that scared me more than anything I'd experienced solo. I got a site on a Thursday afternoon, one of the walk-in tent sites near the back of the loop, a little more private than the drive-up spots, backed up against some lodgepole pines with a view down toward the lake. I set up my tent, got a fire going in the ring even though it was a warm afternoon, mostly for the smell of it, and let Juniper run around on her long lead while I read. The site next to mine, maybe 40 feet away through some brush, had a truck camper parked in it. A big one, the kind that sits on the bed of a 1-ton pickup with a generator humming quietly. I'd noticed the man who was staying there when I pulled in. Sort of a passing glance, mid-50s I'd guess. Gray hair cut short, wearing one of those fishing shirts with all the vented panels, standing near his rig. He'd given me a nod when I drove past. Nothing unusual. Campground neighbors do that. Around 6 p.m. that first evening, he walked over while I was cooking dinner on my little camp stove and introduced himself, said his name was Gary, I'll use that, it's not his real name, and that he was up there for a week fishing the lake and some of the creeks nearby. He seemed honestly completely normal at first, talked about his truck, asked about my dog, mentioned he used to camp up there with his own family years back before his kids grew up and stopped wanting to come. Ordinary campground small talk. I didn't think anything of it. I even remember thinking it was nice, having a friendly neighbor since I was there alone. But the first thing that felt slightly off happened that same night, late, around 11:30. I remember lying there thinking, okay, that's a little strange, but people talk to themselves, especially alone in a camper for a week. I told myself it was nothing. I fell asleep eventually. The next morning, Friday, I took Juniper on a hike around the lake, came back around 2 p.m., and Gary was sitting in a camp chair near the boundary between our sites, like he'd positioned himself specifically to see me coming back. He asked how the hike was, very friendly, and then, almost as an aside, said, "You should be careful walking her off leash near the tree line back there. I've seen someone back in those trees the last couple nights." I asked him what he meant, who he'd seen. He said he wasn't sure, just a shape, moving between the trees around the time everyone's fires died down, maybe 11, midnight. Said he'd mentioned it to the campground host that morning, but the host hadn't seen anything and didn't seem too concerned. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease at this, the kind you get from any story about someone lurking near a campground, but I also didn't fully trust it. Something about the way he delivered it felt performed, like he was watching for my reaction more than actually warning me. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside the tent. And there are a lot of normal sounds at a full campground. Other people's fires crackling, someone's dog barking 2 sites over, wind in the pines. Every single one of them made me tense up, listening for footsteps that weren't camp noise. Around 1 a.m., I heard again Gary's voice outside his camper, low, and this time I could make out a few more words. He said something like, "Not tonight, not with her here," and then nothing else. I lay there for probably 20 minutes convinced I'd misheard it, that it had to be a phone call, though it hadn't sounded like one. No pauses for a response, no ringtone beforehand that I'd heard. Saturday morning, I decided, mostly out of unease I couldn't fully justify to myself, to walk over to the campground host's site and just casually ask if there had been any reports of prowlers or unusual activity in the loop. The host, an older woman named Diane, who lived there seasonally in her own trailer, said Gary had come by the day before saying something similar, but that she'd walked the tree line herself that morning and hadn't found any sign. No footprints, no disturbed brush. "No," she said, kind of carefully. "Between you and me, hun, that fella's been up here about 8 days now, and he was here alone last week too, before you got here. Talks a lot." That detail didn't sit right with me, that he'd been there for over a week already, alone, and had reportedly had these sightings even before I arrived. It shifted something in how I was reading the whole situation. I went back to my site more unsettled than before. Not because I now believed there was a real prowler, but because I was starting to wonder if Gary himself was the thing I should actually be worried about. I want to describe the specific moment that made me decide to leave early, because it's the part that still replays in my head. It was Saturday evening, around 8:45, dusk coming down, that blue hour where everything at altitude gets very still and cold air starts sliding down off the peaks into the basin. I was packing up my cooking gear when I noticed Gary standing at the edge of his site, not doing anything, just standing, facing toward the tree line behind our sites, the same tree line he'd claimed to see someone in. He stood like that, motionless, for probably 5 full minutes. I watched him because I genuinely couldn't tell what he was doing. Then he turned his head, slowly, and looked directly at me. Not a glance, a held look, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, expressionless. Then he said, across the distance between our sites, in a completely flat, conversational tone, "You haven't seen him yet?" I asked him, my voice came out steadier than I felt, what exactly he meant, who he was. Gary just looked at me a moment longer and said, "You'll know when you do," and then turned and went back into his camper, and I heard the door latch. I did not sleep in that tent that night. I loaded Juniper and everything I could grab quickly into my car within about 20 minutes, left the tent standing because I wasn't going to spend another minute in that site breaking it down, and drove down to a pullout near Tom's place where I sat in my car with the doors locked until it was light enough to feel safe driving the rest of the way back to Mammoth. I went back for the tent 2 days later, in full daylight, with a friend from work who came with me. Gary's site was empty by then. Diane, the host, said he'd checked out the morning after I left, a day earlier than his reservation was booked through. I reported the interaction to the Inyo County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the unease it left me with, and because his comment, "You haven't seen him yet, you will," felt like it deserved to be on some kind of record, even if it wasn't technically a threat I could point to a law about. The deputy I spoke with was polite, but understandably, there wasn't much they could act on. Strange words said by a camper who'd since checked out and left no trace of a crime isn't something they can build a case around. Want to explain, and it's the reason this story doesn't have a clean ending the way I wish it did. When my friend and I went back to break down my campsite, she noticed something in the dirt near the back of my tent, right against the tree line Gary had kept pointing to. A single set of boot prints, larger than mine, coming out of the trees and stopping about 6 feet from where my tent had stood, then turning around and going back in. Not close enough to definitively prove someone had been right up against my tent, not far enough to feel like nothing. We didn't know if they were old, if they were Gary's own prints from when he supposedly went to check the tree line himself, or if they belonged to someone else entirely. A hiker cutting through, another camper, anyone. There was no way to date them, no way to trace them to a person. Diane didn't remember seeing anyone else back there. I never went back to that campground to ask further questions, and I haven't camped at Rock Creek since, though I still drive past the turnoff sometimes on my way to other trailheads, and every time, I feel that same specific cold drop in my stomach. I never saw Gary again. I don't know his last name. Even Gary isn't real, like I said. I don't know if he was genuinely warning me about something he believed was real, if he was mentally unwell and talking to something only he could perceive, or if he was, in some way I still can't fully make myself think through all the way describing himself. "You haven't seen him yet." I've turned that sentence over so many times. Sometimes I think it was meant to scare me for its own sake, a strange man getting a thrill out of unsettling a woman alone at a campsite. Other times, especially at night, I think about the boot prints. And I think about the fact that he checked out a day early, right after I left, and I wonder if I only avoided finding out what he meant by leaving when I did. I keep Juniper's leash a little shorter now when we camp. I don't sit with my back to tree lines anymore, and I still, almost a year later, haven't figured out what to do with that sentence, so I'm just going to leave it here the way he left it with me, unfinished, no explanation, nothing tied up. Thanks so much for watching. If these stories hit for you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we've got a lot more true horror stories coming your way every week. If you've had a strange encounter of your own, out on a trail, at a campsite, anywhere in the backcountry, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment from someone just like you. And hey, if you made it this far into the video, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So stick around, because next time we're heading somewhere else entirely. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. Stay safe out there, and maybe think twice before you camp alone.